Well, thank you, Mark, for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Bioceuticals, and Dr. Mark Houston for the opportunity to present the topic in a way that I really appreciate. One of the challenges of being involved in this medicine is what I call drive-by lectures. Okay, so here I have this huge body of knowledge, and yet we're only allowed to present this little snippet of it, so we can tantalize you, but we can't actually change your clinical skills. So my hope is that over this next 2 days, you will be able to develop some clinical skills that on Monday when you see your patients, you actually will be able to make a difference in their lives. And I also like to thank the kind and friendly people of Australia. My dear wife and I, Laura, just finished a 14-day motorcycle tour of Southeast Australia, and we were struck by three things. Number one, how friendly people are. Two, how beautiful and unpolluted your environment appears to be. And number three, and this may sound like common knowledge to you, is outside the big cities, how deep orange the yolks of your eggs are. Okay, because if you come to the U.S., you see what our eggs look like, you'll see what mass-produced eggs look like. They're very, very pale. So it tells me you have more nutrition there. Okay, so I'm going to talk about toxins over the next 2 days. And I broke it into three categories. What I'm calling exogenous toxins or environmental toxins, endogenous toxins, toxins that come from within, and a third category I added called toxins of choice. Now, one of the things I hope you're going to learn over this next 2 days is that while we have a lot of research on the damaging effect of specific toxins, the more I studied this topic, the more I've become to appreciate that's the total body load of toxins, which is by far the most important. So while we will think of alcohol as a toxin, for example, obviously drink too much alcohol is bad for you, but what most people don't realize that when you drink too much alcohol, you deplete your glutathione stores, so now you are more susceptible to other environmental toxins. So the idea is total body load has a huge impact. Now, when we're saying toxins is important for health and disease, what are we talking about? So let's look at this slide. And by the way, I'm going to show you almost all the data I have is primarily US, Canada, and UK because you don't have as much data from Australia. But where I've taken a look at Australian data, I found very clear parallels, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. So I'm going to do some Australia data to start with, then it's primarily going to be US data. So this is diabetes. So I've been involved in medicine now for almost half a century. And so when I was a student back in the early 70s, diabetes was not very common. I remember my first year of practice back in 1975, I saw one diabetic my first year. So not very common. Over the last 50 years, and by the way, this particular chart uses the same diagnostic criteria for diabetes over this long period of time, because they probably know about 10 years ago the criteria for diabetes was changed. So this is the same criteria for diabetes. Diabetes went from less than 1% of the population, according to these categories, to now 8 times higher. Okay. Now, did we change genetically? No. Are we eating more sugar? Actually, no. We're not eating much more sugar. Are we eating more refined food? Yes. Are we exercising less? Yes. But does that explain this dramatic increase in diabetes? And the answer is no. Now, before you say, well, that's US data, okay, here's Australia data. Okay, you're doing the same thing. So your incidence of diabetes has about tripled over the last 20 years. So if you superimpose the Australian data on diabetes over the US data on diabetes, you're about 10 years behind us. And when I look at all the other toxins, where I've been able to get data on the toxins, it all looks like about the same, where you have the same levels of toxins for some things as in the US, and in other areas you have less levels of toxins. But the bottom line is you have toxic load just like we do in the US. So what we're going to do over the next 2 days, we're going to talk about the types of toxins, where they come from, how they damage our bodies, what clinical conditions you should be looking at to be considered particularly important in terms of toxins. We're going to talk about how to get rid of the toxins and how to assess them, how to get rid of them, and I'll give you case histories. So to give you an idea of what we're going to cover, what would you say if I told you, if you look at a disease like, let's say, osteoporosis? Now, you all know osteoporosis due to a deficiency of calcium, deficiency of vitamin D, and if you're really smart, you know about vitamin K2, all being important. What if I told you that 21% of osteoporosis is due to cadmium poisoning? Okay? Now, how about if you're counseling pregnant women? And by the way, something I noticed, you have a lot of children, a lot of pregnant women in Australia. Don't see that in the US. I congratulate you. So,
We're 10 years behind.
You're 10 years behind. Probably true. So don't make the same mistakes we've made, please. Okay. Anyway, pregnant women. So I'm sure pregnant women come to you for counseling. Now, one of the nice things about being a naturopathic physician in the state of Washington, I used to do natural childbirth. So I did a lot of counseling for women and helped bring their children into the world, which is wonderful. If you look at women in the top 20% of chemical exposure and compare them to pregnant women in the bottom 20% of chemical exposure, and then you look at the IQ of the children and you wipe out all the socioeconomic differences, that child born to the woman with the highest level of chemical exposure has a 7-point drop in IQ. And that study, and it's now been reproduced by 4 studies, one of which followed these kids for 7 years. After 7 years, they still had a 7-point drop in IQ, and they have a doubling of ADHD. Okay, do you think maybe toxicity is important? Okay, so I can give you lots of examples to start looking at them. So first off, we look at toxicity detoxification and realize that these are long-term concepts that have been around in natural medicine since our origins. Ayurvedic medicine from India, very engaged in detoxification. Particularly, they need it because they add heavy metals to many of their compounds, so you have to be very careful about Ayurvedic medicines. Naturopathic medicine from the US was founded on the concept of detoxification and nutrition. Traditional health spas are about detoxification. And 2 old naturopathic adages. I call them old naturopathic adages because I was told them as a student almost 50 years ago. That is what? When in doubt, detoxify the liver, and disease begins in the colon. Now, I thought those were kind of quaint concepts, but I now realize the wisdom of these elders. So when in doubt, detoxify the liver. I'll start there. Personal experience have impacted a lot of people's lives. So way back in the early 70s, I was working in medical research at the University of Washington School of Medicine, Department of Rheumatology. And my life goal at that point was to become a medical researcher because I just love science. So I was looking for a cure for arthritis with these MDs and PhDs and deeply involved in laboratory work. And then the woman who married my roommate from college, who suffered from juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, became cured of her arthritis. I thought, well, that's weird. This is an incurable disease. How did she get cured? So I said, well, what happened? She said, well, I went to a naturopathic doctor and he cured me. I said, what? Naturopathic doctor? I mean, all I knew was that there was medical doctors. I didn't even know there were chiropractors. Okay, I mean, I just write straight science. So I went to this naturopathic doctor and asked him, well, what did you do for my friend? He said, well, I detoxified her liver and taught her how to eat properly. I think, what did her liver have to do with her hands and her knees being swollen? And there began a journey, which leads us here today. So let's get started. So this is a list of the toxins as defined by the US federal government as most important. I could not find the comparable list in Australia. My assumption is you're going to be similar. I don't know if that's exactly true. Interestingly enough, you notice the top 3 are metals: arsenic, lead, and mercury, then vinyl chloride, polychlorinated biphenyls, benzene. Where do you get benzene? Do you pump your own gasoline? When the gasoline you smell, you're putting benzene into your body. Cadmium, benzopyrenes, et cetera, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So PAHs, where do you get PAHs? Do you like your Barbie? You know, that nice brown tasty material on the edge of your meat? PAHs. Do you smoke? That stuff you're inhaling? PAHs. Anyway, so this is the list according to the federal government. So how about Australia? So look at some Australia data. I was looking at PBDEs. So PBDEs, as you may know, are flame retardants we put into clothing. And so I was trying to see now, how do Australian data compare to US data? And I looked at this study and I saw, oh, that's interesting. It looks like in the dust you don't have as much PDEs as US, about 1/3 as much. Now these things, by the way, are very powerful endocrine disruptors. But then I looked at a study that compared the amount of PDBEs in fat stores in Australians compared to the US. And it turns out that the US and Australia have comparable amounts of these things in our fat stores, and we're higher than the rest of the world. So clearly, you folks have real chemical exposure. And then how does it correlate to things like breast cancer? So for example, chemical exposure directly correlates with breast cancer. You look at the growing incidence of breast cancer in Australia and you see what you would expect with chemical exposure. Okay. So I'm not going to spend more time talking about Australian versus US data. The reality is you have the same problems we have. They're a little bit different here and there, but the bottom line is toxicity is causing disease in your country as well as in ours. So let's keep going. So I'll start with heavy metals. So the main ones that are important are lead, mercury, arsenic, and cadmium. And they're considered most important because they're the most prevalent in terms of our exposure, and they clearly have been associated with disease and demonstrated to cause disease. And the challenge with them is that while they have their own specific ways of damaging the body, which we'll cover, they all do the same in general things, and that is they increase free radical production. So you'll see again and again and again, increased free radical production, oxidative stress are very, very common problems with virtually all the toxins. They poison enzyme systems. So typically what happens with the metals is that this displaces minerals for the enzyme systems, and now the enzyme systems don't work properly. They directly damage DNA, they are endocrine disruptors, and they cause mitochondrial damage as well as cell wall damage, but particularly mitochondrial damage. And there's growing research now, actually I have a whole hour lecture just on mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondrial dysfunction is becoming prevalent in our modern society. So, as you might expect, the amount of metals in our environment continues to go up. This is clearly a part of modern industrialization. We have more and more metals in our environment, and they are going up. And the problem with the metals in the environment as compared to the chemicals, and we'll get to chemicals later on, with the metals is that we don't have ways to break down metals because they're basically elements. You can't break them down, so it has to be sequestered. So what happens is that these things build up in the environment, and they get higher and higher levels as we go along. So let's look at lead. So one of the big challenges in looking at the research on toxicity is how do you define what are the safe standards? By definition, the safe standards in the US for metals, with one exception, which I'll talk about in a moment, is if you're in the top 5% of the population's exposure, you have a toxic level. If you're in the bottom 95% of exposure, you're normal. Okay, so that's how lead was determined. So you look at this number here, looking at lead at 60. So way back in 50 years ago, 60 was considered the transition between toxic and non-toxic. So that's basically, it's micrograms per deciliter. Well, researchers started showing that, well, people even below 60 were having clear toxic effects. So for example, you see a direct inverse correlation between child's IQ and amount of lead exposure. If you look at adults, you see a direct correlation between amount of lead and hypertension, myocardial infarction, et cetera. So they said, okay, well, we should drop it down. They dropped it to 40. Well, people were still getting toxic reactions at 40. They dropped it to 30. Then they dropped it to 25. Then they dropped it to 10, and now it's at 10. Well, I'm going to show you research demonstrating that between 5 and 10, clear disease correlations. Now, here's an example of a good public health measure. So you look at the green bubbles, or green circles, those were the average blood levels in the population. And what happened right here, if you can see that, is we removed lead from gasoline. So when you're looking at a smart public health measure to decrease toxicity in the population, getting lead out of gasoline was a smart move. Okay, so that worked. I believe, looking at the research now, that we should have 5 micrograms per deciliter should be the maximum for lead at this point. So let's look at some of the data on lead. So this is a study done in Canadians, and all the Canadians that were tested had detectable levels. Now that's not a very good statistic because it depends on how good the equipment is. But what they found was looking at adults in Canada with blood lead levels between 5 and 9 micrograms per deciliter had direct correlation with all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. So clearly, even low levels of lead are really, really toxic to us, and that's significant in the population in Canada. Then we started looking at, anyway, that's it for lead. Mercury. I'm going to spend more time on mercury because I believe this is a bigger problem now than is lead, and the good news is that we could do something about it. So mercury is an enzyme poison, causes oxidative stress, it causes tissue damage, particularly the neurological system is very sensitive to mercury, particularly the system for children and fetuses are very toxic, sensitive to mercury. One of the reasons why mercury toxicity has not been properly detected or recognized is because there's a long lead time between exposure and the damage that mercury does in the body. The brain, kidneys are particularly susceptible, but the fetus and infants are the most susceptible. So where does mercury come from? So the source of mercury are very, very clear. Number one is silver fillings. So so-called silver fillings are 55% mercury. Okay, and each silver filling leaks about 1 microgram of mercury into the body every day. Second primary source is going to be, by the way, the number 10 is there because the average person has about 10 silver fillings. Fish is the next source. And unfortunately, research does not differentiate very well between high mercury fish and low mercury fish. But basically, for the average person, about 2.3 micrograms per day come into the body from eating fish. Water is another source. Air is a source. Vaccinations is a source, but I'll tell you, in my own opinion, again, I'm very science-oriented. I'm a true believer in natural medicine, but I'm very science-oriented. I don't think mercury in vaccinations is a significant source of mercury. I think that while it's not good putting that into children that are particularly susceptible to it, that dose compared to other sources is actually relatively small. And finally, of course, there's some industrial. Now, one of these is look at air. So air. So I'm going to tell you about a corporate wellness program I did in Canada. I'll show you some data from that. And this was a really fun program. So one of the wealthiest men in Canada sent his private jet down to Seattle to pick me up and fly me to Calgary, Alberta. And he said, I would like you to develop a wellness program for my oil field workers. I have 4,500 oil field workers. I've been doing conventional wellness programs with them for about 10 years. I'm not getting much results. Can you help me? So I said to him, well, sure. I have lots of ideas what I could do for your people, but I want to do some lab tests. I want to check them for toxicity, check them for nutritional deficiencies, check metabolic activity. How much can I spend? He said, blank check. I said, blank check? He said, yes. He said, if you can convince me the test is worth doing, I will run it. So I ran the equivalent of $1,500 lab tests on 4,500 oil field workers. Okay, so I have lots and lots of data. Now, one of the fun things about that is we also tested ourselves. So I designed this thing. We had 7 MDs and 1 ND who then administered this program to his employees. By the way, by the time he was done, he had 2 MDs and 9 NDs. Okay, to follow on what Mark had to say about, he started finding who had the proper training for health promotion rather than disease treatment. Anyway, I found I had high mercury levels. Now, this was a shock to me because I'm primarily vegetarian. I eat a little bit of fish, but only small fish, the healthy fish. I don't have any silver fillings. How come I had mercury? So I was mentioning this to a friend of mine who worked as a research assistant to an atmospheric sciences professor at the University of Washington. And every few years, this fellow would get a grant from the federal government to take an airplane up into the air with very expensive equipment and sample what was in the air over Seattle. He found mercury in the air over Seattle. He said, well, why is there so much mercury? So he started circling around, and he found, quote, a river of mercury coming to Seattle from, what do you think? Louder. China. Coal burning in China, putting mercury into the air, comes over the beautiful Pacific Northwest, and all that rain we get, we really do, dumps it into Seattle. So air is a source as well. I'll show you some data on that. So amalgams. So the conventional dental groups have dismissed the concept that mercury in teeth affects humans. And the way they were able to do this was by obfuscating the data. So if you look at the number of teeth with fillings and compare it to the amount of mercury in the urine or mercury in the brain or things like that, you get very, very poor correlations. However, if you correlate the surface area of mercury in the mouth with mercury in the body, you get very strong correlations. Now, as we as clinicians, measuring surface area in the mouth is difficult to do. But what you can do is count the number of fillings in the mouth, okay? So if you look at a tooth, it could have one tiny little filling, or the whole top of the tooth can be covered with mercury. So if the whole top's covered with mercury, that counts as 6 fillings. If there's only one tiny filling, it counts as 1 filling. When you do that kind of evaluation, you actually get a very good correlation. So let's look at this. So amalgams in the mouth. This looks at the amount of mercury in the urine. And as you can see, very clear correlation. The more mercury in the mouth, the more mercury in the urine, okay? So it's about amalgam surface area or the number of amalgams, not necessarily the number of teeth with amalgams. So, okay, fine, mercury in the urine, well, does that mean anything? Well, how about mercury in the brain? So this is research done in autopsies, and what they did was they counted the number of fillings in people's mouths, and then they basically looked at the amount of mercury in various parts of the brain. As you can see, a very, very clear correlation. Mercury in the mouth, mercury in the brain, damage to the brain. Then how about live? So you might say, okay, those are dead tissue. That doesn't count because maybe something happened when people die. Okay, how about live tissues? So this is a study done in Scandinavia. What they did with these people was they looked at kidney transplants. They looked at the amount of mercury in the kidney transplants, and then again did the same thing, counted the number of fillings in the mouth. What they found was that a 0.62 correlation between the amount of mercury in the kidneys and the amount of mercury in the mouth. So very, very clear correlation. The majority of the mercury in the body is coming from the mouth, okay? And what they found was that there's a 6% increase in mercury for every filling in the mouth. So very, very clear correlations here. Okay, so how about fish, mercury from fish? Again, this study did not differentiate the kind of fish that was being consumed, but what they did look at was how much fish people consume in terms of servings per week. And again, very strong correlation between mercury in the blood and the urine and the amount of fish that was being eaten. The study also went a little further, and they looked at psychomotor dysfunction, and they found actually a pretty good correlation between the amount of mercury, both in the blood, but particularly in the urine, and psychomotor dysfunction. So here we're seeing now real clinical effects from that mercury. Mercury in the air. Now, I have found data in the U.S. for mercury in the air and in the U.K. I could not find mercury in the air in Australia nor in Canada. Now, if you wonder if you're being exposed to mercury in the air, the two primary sources are coal-burning plants for electrical energy production, but the other one, which most people aren't aware of, but it's just as big a problem, and that's cement manufacturing facilities. So if you're downwind from either coal burning or from cement manufacturing, because they burn coal for cement manufacturing, you'll find high levels of mercury. So here we are in Seattle, and lots and lots of mercury there in Seattle coming from China. And we also see a big chunk right here in New England, and that's because coal burning is the primary source of energy production in New England, and also same thing here down in Florida, where the primary source of energy production is coal burning. So I'm going to say something that's probably not politically correct here, but I'm going to say it anyway. Being concerned about global warming is stupid. We have to be concerned about the mercury being released by coal-burning plants, much, much bigger effects. The Earth can deal with carbon dioxide. The Earth cannot deal with mercury. Okay, so as you might expect, you've got mercury in the air, you get mercury in the water. And where's the majority of mercury coming from in the world? Over 50%? China. So China is being very irresponsible. They're dumping a lot of mercury into the world, and by far the vast majority of mercury in the world is coming from China. Okay. So this is sad. So when I was a student a long time ago, we were told that the fetus is so important that nature does all it can to protect the fetus, give the fetus optimal nutrition, protect the fetus from toxins so we can get the healthiest babies possible. Well, actually, nature had a different idea. Nature decides mother's more important than the fetus, so the mother concentrates toxins in the fetus as a way of getting rid of them. Okay, so if you start looking at the amount of mercury in the mother's brain, the amount of mercury in the cord, the amount of mercury in blood, what we find is that you get about 40% more mercury in the fetus than you do in the mother. Okay, and of course that results in neurological damage to the fetus. Okay, cadmium. Where does cadmium come from? So this is as you can see, all my slides are referenced. So this comes from a source that looked at various metals where they're coming from, and this is where cadmium comes from. So cigarette smoking is by far the major source of cadmium for the majority of the population. But I'm going to show you a study in a moment, which is actually changing that long-held belief. So I can tell you that from my work in Canada, I could tell you which oilfield workers were smokers and which weren't, because their cadmium levels were twice as high as the non-smokers. It's very clear. Combustion of industrial household waste, sewage, contaminated food. So sewage, I don't know if you do this the same as in the U.S., but in the U.S., we do this in Seattle, for example, you can get organic fertilizer from reprocessed waste from cities. Don't do it. Yes, it's organic, but it has very high levels of cadmium in it, okay? And so unfortunately, using this reprocessed sewage, et cetera, is a very significant source of cadmium. So basically about half the cadmium comes from cigarette smoke, and about half comes from diet. 73% of women over the age of 50 have cadmium levels in the blood greater than 50 micrograms per gram, creatinine, okay? And that's correlated with a increased risk for osteoporosis, 43% increased risk of osteoporosis if above 0.5. So it turns out cadmium is a very significant source. But if you look at the same level, again, 73% of women, 80% increased risk of myocardial infarction. So over half the women in the U.S., the primary risk of myocardial infarction turns out to be high cadmium levels. Now, it's not too surprising because, as you remember from Mark's great lecture yesterday morning, oxidized cholesterol is very, very bad. And one of the key things that these toxins do is they do things like oxidize cholesterol. So not surprised to see these correlations. Okay, now here's a big surprise. The study actually came out of Seattle, And in Seattle, they were looking at perimenopausal women, and they're seeing a surprising incidence of osteoporosis and myocardial infarction. They're wondering, well, what's going on? So they then measured these women. They found they had high levels of cadmium. Then they did an analysis, figure out where's the cadmium coming from. It was coming from soy. So what was happening is you have women who are perimenopausal, we're prescribing to them soy. How many of you prescribe soy to your perimenopausal women? Come on, you're supposed to, you don't do that here? Oh, interesting. Okay, well, we do that in the U.S. Well, the soy was being raised with synthetic fertilizers. Synthetic fertilizers, particularly the high phosphorus fertilizers, the phosphorus-rich fertilizers, are high in cadmium. The cadmium goes right into soy and right into human beings. Okay, so that's this study that found that 21% of osteoporosis is due to cadmium toxicity. So as cadmium damages the body, a bunch of mechanisms. Again, as I mentioned before, it functions by increasing oxidative stress, but it also turns out to poison enzyme systems, particularly in the thyroid. So what happens is you need, as you probably know, you need selenium in the thyroid to convert the T4 to T3 in the cells, and the deiodinase enzymes that do that work are poisoned by cadmium. So you have a person who's both deficient in selenium and high in cadmium, which is what you typically see when eating conventionally grown foods. You now have a problem converting thyroid to its most active form. So it displaces zinc, displaces copper, displaces iron, displaces calcium, and displaces selenium. Okay, so you start looking at cadmium exposure in cardiovascular disease, and a 50% increase in blood cadmium is associated with 35% increase in stroke and a 48% increase in heart failure. 50% increase in urinary calcium is associated with 9 and 12% increase in stroke and heart failure. Now notice there's a better correlation between blood levels of cadmium and urine levels of cadmium. You might say, well, wait, why is there such a strong correlation with blood and not such a strong correlation with urine? The reason is that we have a huge problem getting cadmium out of the body. As a matter of fact, it gets stuck in the kidneys. So when the body tries to get rid of it, it can't get rid of it very well. So your urine levels, which is one of the standards for determining cadmium toxicity, underestimate the amount of cadmium in the body because the kidneys can't get rid of it. You may have heard about 10, 20 years ago, there were doctors out there, cardiologists, doing chelation therapy to help people with cardiovascular disease, to help chelate out the arteries. They ran into problems with kidney failure. The reason they ran into problems with kidney failure is because the chelate agents they were using were basically liberating cadmium from tissues, but then it got liberated and got dumped into the kidneys, but the kidneys could not get rid of them, so they actually ended up with kidney failure. And unfortunately, a potentially useful technique fell into ill favor. Okay, arsenic. I don't have as much information on arsenic because, and this is interesting when you look at research, I didn't find a lot of arsenic in my huge Canadian study. But I was then surprised to find that the US EPA considers arsenic actually one of the worst toxins people are exposed to. So there's a disjunct there, and I think the problem here is that the methods we have available for determining arsenic load in the body aren't good enough. So the primary sources of arsenic are water. So many of the water supplies are contaminated with arsenic as a natural product in the environment and from diet. It turns out that a substantial portion of the U.S. population has excess arsenic in their water supply. Don't know what the data is for Australia in terms of water supply. I would assume you have the same kind of challenges. When we started looking then at foods that are rich in arsenic, turns out seafood, rice, mushroom, and poultry are particularly good sources of arsenic if arsenic is something you want in your body. Now, the target issues tend to be kidneys and liver. We started looking at clinical effects of arsenic. It turns out that there's a very strong correlation with diabetes. And I'll show you some data on that in a moment. So correlation with diabetes. We also see clear correlation with cardiovascular disease, cancer, skin disease, and gastrointestinal disease. Okay, cancer. So when we think about lung cancer, of course, we all think about cigarette smoking, and for good reason, because it does increase the risk of lung cancer. Are you aware that low vitamin D levels give you almost as much risk of lung cancer as smoking cigarettes? Anyway, those who are in the top quintile of arsenic exposure have a 3 to 5-fold increased risk for lung cancer. So clearly the arsenic is acting as a chronic, you might say, oxidant to the DNA of our tissues, increasing our risk for cancer. Okay, that finishes our metals. Next we'll go to persistent organic pollutants. Now when we're looking at the persistent organic pollutants, we're basically I want to say, it's not just the POPs for short, it's all the chemical exposure. The reason I'm focusing more on the persistent organic pollutants is because these chemicals were specifically designed to be difficult to break down in the environment and in our bodies. Okay? And the reason they were done, that was done was to, quote, ensure that they hang around for a longer period of time to then have the physiological effects that they were looking for. So these things are difficult to break down chemically, biologically, photolytically. The sun can't break them down either. They bioaccumulate in the food chain. They bioaccumulate in humans. The World Health Organization started becoming concerned about these things back in 1995, just about 20 years ago, and started creating a list of the POPs that they consider to be worse, and of course that list keeps getting longer and longer. Now, one of the reasons why we were not accurately aware of the problem with POPs before is because most researchers were looking at these chemicals with the same kind of technologies and methodologies that were looking at metals. So with lead, for example, and mercury and arsenic and cadmium, gives nice direct linear correlation between the dose and the effects in the body. We don't see that with the POPs. Now, some POPs have a direct linear correlation, but many POPs have a U-shaped curve. That U-shaped curve can show high toxicity, low levels, no toxicity or low toxicity at medium levels, again, high toxicity at high levels again, and sometimes you get the exact reverse. So the non-linearity of the chemicals made it more difficult for them to be recognized as problematic in the body. But when researchers started looking at total body load of POPs, they then found very, very strong correlations. So I will talk about some of the POPs because it's important to know what they do, like organophosphate pesticides, for example, are just really, really bad at any dosage. Remember, it's the total body load which is most important. Okay, so when we start now looking at the POPs in humans, it turns out that there are probably about 20,000 of these things in the environment, but about 75 of them are at high enough dosages to affect human physiology. So you see, most of these studies I'm going to show you look at between 10 and 100 POPs because they're the ones at the highest dosages. I'm not saying the others aren't important, particularly for some subpopulations with exposure, but these are the ones that are most problematic. Okay, so what do these things do? Number one, endocrine disruption. So it turns out that these things are very good at binding to receptor sites. So they bind to insulin receptor sites, they bind to estrogen receptor sites, they bind to testosterone receptor sites. Sometimes they turn them on unintentionally, sometimes they turn them off unintentionally, but it turns out endocrine disruption is number one. Very close behind is blood sugar regulation disruption. In general, almost all, majority of these things block insulin receptor sites. You get metabolic syndrome in people because of chemical exposure. Remember I showed you that slide of diabetes, okay, growth in diabetes? Chemical exposure is now a stronger predictor of diabetes than eating sugar, being overweight, not exercising. It's by far now the strongest predictor of diabetes because they poison insulin receptor sites. So the reason you get prediction of diabetes with this is because when you get insulin receptor site resistance, as you know, then the pancreas has to pump out more insulin in order to get the sugar into the cells. After about 10, 20, 30 years, depending upon the person and how bad it is, the pancreas wears out and can't keep producing all that excess insulin, so now the blood sugar levels start going up. We say, oh, all of a sudden you've got diabetes. No, you took 10 to 30 years to get there. You only got the diabetes when the pancreas finally gave up and couldn't do it anymore. The other things they do do mitochondrial damage. They poison mitochondria, so you get decreased ATP production. They increase production of inflammatory cytokines. So now this is important because you know when you have the flu, how you feel kind of achy and tired. Well, the achy tiredness comes from the cytokines that have been increased by your immune system as part of the process of fighting off the virus. So it turns out these things do the same kinds of effect as if having a chronic infection. So how about if you have a patient who's obese, wants to lose weight? You start losing weight, they're starting to lose fat. Well, what's in the fat? Persistent organic pollutants. So their blood levels of these POPs go up. They start feeling crappy while losing weight, which is a nice negative feedback loop about not wanting to lose weight. Okay. So there's other factors that are important. You can look at your notes. But the other one, which is really scary, is this one: intrauterine, epigenetic, and transgenerational effects. So research has now been shown where we take a pregnant rat, you expose this pregnant rat to persistent organic pollutants, and then feed her children, her daughters and her granddaughters a normal diet her granddaughters have increased incidence of diabetes because the epigenetic changes induced in the grandmother. Okay, so look at that diabetes chart I showed you. We're in the second generation of POP exposure in our population. So now we're seeing not only current POP damage, but we're seeing epigenetic damage from what happened to our grandparents. Right? Yeah, are you paranoid enough? The first time I gave this lecture was 2 years ago. The first person came up, and the question, he said, that was the most depressing lecture I've ever heard. Okay. This is serious, folks. I mean, this is real data showing that this is having a huge impact on our health, and it's health now of our children and our grandchildren. Okay, so we start looking at diseases, diabetes. So the correlations between chemical exposure and diabetes are so strong, researchers are now calling these chemicals diabetogens. Okay, so if you look at this one study, a quote here, they only looked at 6 POPs, looked at correlation between 6 POPs and diabetes, and found those in the top quintile of exposure had a 5-fold increased risk of metabolic syndrome and diabetes. There's another study, I don't recall if I have it in this slide, look at those in the top 10% exposure of all POPs, found a 20-fold increased risk for diabetes. 20-fold. No other factor we have has that strong correlation with diabetes, let alone most any other disease. Hypertension, clear correlations. Obesity, clear correlations. So researchers are now calling these chemicals obesogens because high levels of chemical exposure result in increased diabetes, increased obesity. So as you might expect, what's happening when you're blocking the ability to put sugar into the normal cells, sugar is still going more easily into the fat cells, and now you get more fat cell production while people are still tired because they're not producing enough energy. So you start looking at POPs and diabetes, and you see just study after study showing direct correlation between metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, diabetes, all showing the same thing. More POPs, more trouble with blood sugar control. So this is the research looking at IQ in children. So this research looked at both pregnant women and the 7-point drop in IQ, and that 7-point drop in IQ persisted for 7 years, and the one study looked at over 7 years. They also then looked at where it was damaging the IQ, and what was damaging was what's called working memory. So working memory is when you hear something, you remember it right away. It's just something you're using, like you're doing mathematics, you're using working memory. It's like, think about computers. You've got the memory on the chip versus the hard drive, okay? So looking at the memory on the computer chip, what you see here is very clear. As you get higher and higher exposure to chemical toxins, you get less and less working memory. So the working memory goes down and IQ goes down. And there's study after study, they're all showing the same thing, that as you have higher and higher chemical exposure, you have lower and lower IQ in the children. And the worst of them by far are what are called the organophosphate pesticides. Now, where did organophosphate pesticides come from? Anybody know? World War I as nerve agents, okay? So we now spray them on food to kill the neurological systems of insects, which works. Why do we think they're not going to damage our neurological systems as well? Anyway, so organophosphate pesticides are amongst the worst. And what food is highest in organophosphate pesticides? You're gonna hate this answer. Kale. Conventionally grown kale. Kale is a wonderful superfood. Conventionally grown kale has the highest level of organophosphate pesticides. Okay, so now I want to kind of summarize how toxins damage the body. Then we'll look at some disease correlations. Then we'll start talking about how the body gets rid of them and assessment. Am I doing my time here? Okay. So number one, increased free radical production. Lots and lots of examples. They increase free radicals, bad for us. Poison enzyme systems, lots of examples of that. Replace structural minerals. Now, structural minerals, so sorry if I'm politically incorrect here. As women get into menopause, they're kind of hard to be around. We all thought it was because of all that weird stuff going on with estrogen. They're losing bone. What's in bone? Lead, right? But where's the majority of mercury stored in the body? Bone. Okay, so you have these women who are getting hard to live with around menopause. They're being poisoned with lead and mercury. Now, lest I be politically incorrect, how about grumpy old men? Well, grumpy old men, well, they're getting poisoned with lead and mercury as well, because men lose bone as they get older as well, not just women. Okay, damaged DNA. So every time you're pumping your gasoline, you're smelling that nice gasoline smell. Guess what? You're damaging your DNA. Epigenetic dysmodulation, damaged cell membranes, imbalanced hormones, lots and lots of examples of that. Arsenic disrupting thyroid, phthalates act as anti-androgens, and PCBs lowering testosterone in men. So how do the chemical toxins damage our DNA? And what's happening here, and this is in many ways an example of how wonderful our bodies are. So our bodies are constantly repairing our DNA because DNA is subject to oxidative damage. So we replace the damaged DNA with nucleotides. The problem is with these chemical toxins is that they damage the nucleotides. So nucleotides being put into DNA is now no longer properly formed, and now the DNA that's been repaired is actually more dysfunctional than what was repaired beforehand. Okay. So some disease risks. So these are almost all these are in the top quintiles, and I kind of picked the worst cases. So arsenic, top quintile, 3.58-fold increased risk of diabetes. One study looking at the top quintile of a certain set of POPs found a 38-fold increased risk in diabetes for that particular chemical exposure. Okay, osteoporosis, 21% of osteoporosis due to cadmium. Rheumatoid arthritis, 8.5-fold increased risk for those in the top 20% exposure to PCBs. I mean, these are not small numbers. Okay, and organochlorine pesticides, 3.5-fold increased risk. Osteoarthritis, 2.9-fold increased risk. Cardiovascular disease, POPs, women at top 20% exposure, 5-fold increased risk of various forms of cardiovascular disease. Myocardial infarction, 7% of the U.S. population has levels known to increase myocardial infarction. Neurodegenerative disease, pesticides and mitochondrial poisons, a 2-fold increased risk. And then looking at learning disorders and such, all show correlations with toxin exposure. Okay. One of the advantages of being a vegetarian, and one reason why you see better healthcare statistics in vegetarians as compared to omnivores and compared to carnivores, is vegetarians tend to eat lower on the food supply, so they don't have a high level of concentration of these various toxins in the foods that they eat. And then we have toxin synergy. So here we have a situation where it's not 1 + 1 = 2, but it's 1 + 1 = 3. So what happens is that our bodies have remarkable mechanisms for both detoxifying these chemicals and for protecting us from the oxidative stress. The problem is those systems are saturatable and they're also overloadable. So when you have too much toxic load, we deplete our antioxidant stores, particularly glutathione, and we'll be talking a lot about glutathione. Okay, now how does the body get rid of these toxins? So as we evolved as a species, we're exposed to toxins. So you look at the foods we eat, well, those foods have chemicals in them whose purpose is to protect those foods from insects. So for example, when you look at toxin levels in vegetables, you find there's relatively low levels of pesticides sprayed on cabbage, because cabbage produces a bunch of chemicals that help protect them from the insects. And those chemicals are things like, those DIM and things like that, those indole-3 carbanols, all those things we think are so great for the liver because they help upregulate the enzymes in the liver. Why do you think those enzymes existed in the liver? It was to protect us from those chemicals in the foods, okay? So we have a lot of really effective enzyme systems to protect us. So they're all over the body. We think mainly about them being in high concentrations in the liver, and that's true, but it turns out basically all tissues exposed to the environment have high levels of detoxification enzymes, and they're particularly high in the intestines. The cells lining the intestines are very high in cytochrome P450s. They're in the lungs, nasal epithelium. You smell a strong odor, and it very quickly saturates your nasal ability to smell. So we have cytochrome P450s to break down those chemicals in the nose, so we can then be able to smell new chemicals as become exposed to them. Okay, but the big factor here, I'm going to show you some very important data, and that is there is a 1,000-fold variation in individuals' ability to detoxify chemicals. Okay, so that 1,000-fold variation helps explain what you might call the yellow canaries amongst our population. So it helps explain why some people are very susceptible to chemical exposure below the levels you would think were appropriate, and whereas other people, like I remember when I was in the 50s looking at magazine ads, I remember distinctly this picture of this guy who said, well, I'm 102 years old, I've been smoking cigarettes since I was 5 years old, doesn't bother me. Well, he had the right enzymes, right? and he was paid a lot by the tobacco companies to say that tobacco smoking was not bad for you. Well, he was, of course, the minority. Most people are going to get lung cancer from cigarette smoking. Okay, so we all know about the liver phase 1, phase 2. I assume you've all been involved in this field for quite some time, and it's very important. So phase 1, you either directly detoxify some chemicals, for example, caffeine, cyclone P451A2 directly detoxifies caffeine, but most of these situations, phase 1, basically converts the chemical into a more active form, which is then conjugated by phase 2 to then make it, to detoxify it, and either make a water soluble get out through the urine or also out through the bile. These enzymes have huge genetic variability, and they're highly susceptible to nutritional deficiencies, and they're saturatable. In other words, you can overload them. So if you get too many toxins in one particular, that need one particular enzyme to detoxify, basically it takes a while for the body to get to them, which means you now have more chance for damage. Also, it's very important to realize, and this is critical, although I won't be spending much time with this today, it's critical that phase 2 be as active as phase 1, because phase 1 produces activated forms of these chemicals, which are far more damaging. So, for example, cigarette smoke, the PAHs in cigarette smoke are much more carcinogenic after phase 1 detoxification. You must have good phase 2 to detoxify these activated intermediates, or else they're more damaging. So that's one reason why you see so many more diseases in people who consume more alcohol, or I should say who consume excessive amounts of alcohol, not necessarily because alcohol is toxic, because it is at high dosages, but because alcohol depletes glutathione stores. You deplete glutathione, and now you can't do the phase 2 detoxification that's necessary to protect us from the activated phase 1 intermediates. Okay, so let's look at this. So here's a study looking at cyclone P450 2D6. Let's just look at 2D6. Now 2D6 is important because it detoxifies about 25% of the drugs we prescribe to our patients. Okay, there is an over 1,000-fold. This one actually is a 10,000-fold variation in how well this enzyme works in people. Now in Caucasians, about 7% of Caucasians are poor metabolizers. So they're the folks that are way over here, which means when you give them a standard dose of a drug, they are the ones who get the adverse drug reaction because they can't detoxify the drug quickly enough. Now, conversely, if you look at people who have a black descent from Africa, about 30% of them are also detoxifiers, which means that we give them a standard dose of the drug, it doesn't work because they get rid of it too quickly. Okay. My belief is that it is now malpractice to prescribe a drug to a patient if that drug has known significant toxicity without first knowing the genetics of their ability to detoxify that drug. Now, I made the prediction 10 years ago that within 5 years, all patients would get drug detoxification genomics before they're prescribed a drug, and it still hasn't happened. So I'll make the prediction again. 5 years from now, it'll be malpractice to not know what your patients are reacting to. Now, this is not theoretical. Do you know what the 4th leading cause of death is in the United States? It's probably the same here in Australia. It's the same in the UK. Properly prescribed drugs. I'm not talking about medical mistakes. I'm talking about properly prescribed drugs. For every dollar we spend prescribing a drug, we spend $1.30 dealing with the side effects of the drugs. So it costs us more to deal with the drugs than the drugs themselves cost. Okay? And that's primarily due to the fact we're not paying attention how people detoxify the drugs. Now, many of us in here are doing integrated medicine. Okay? So many of us use ginger, for example, as an anti-inflammatory for a patient with rheumatoid arthritis. Ginger turns off cyclone P450-2D6. So if you have a patient on a standard dose of a drug that's working fine, they're not getting an adverse drug reaction, and then you prescribe ginger to them, you can induce an adverse drug reaction in that patient. Okay, so I'm not saying don't use ginger. I'm not saying don't use drugs. What I'm saying is if you're going to do integrated medicine, you better be very aware of how these things interact with each other because they do. Okay? So same thing with phase 2. We also get huge genetic variations in phase 2 as well. Now, one of the most important phase 2 enzymes is called glutathione conjugation. So what's happened here is that we bind glutathione to these activated intermediates. Now, glutathione is very important because the primary mechanisms we have for getting rid of POPs is glutathione conjugation. Turns out there's huge genetic variations how well we produce glutathione, and those who are the poorest producers of glutathione in response to need are the ones who have increased risk for cancer, increased damage from smoking, increase of cardiovascular disease. Another very important one is acetylation. So it turns out that there's about a fourfold variation in acetylation, and women who have the slow form of acetylation genetics have about a 49% increased risk of breast cancer because the chemicals are particularly damaging to the breast, tend to go through the acetylation pathways. So you can see a bunch of those here. Okay. So POPs are detoxified by phase 1 combined with phase 2. And again, glutathione conjugation is by far the most important. Okay. So variations. So looking at phase 2, this is looking at acetylation. As you can see, there's a fourfold variation in acetylation. And it turns out that these acetylators are very, very slow. Caucasians are relatively slow acetylators compared to Japanese. So everybody knows about Japanese women having far less breast cancer than American women. So the assumption was, well, that's because they eat a lot of soy and they'd have a different kind of diet. Well, that may be true. The reality is that their genetics are much better able to detoxify the chemicals that are most associated with breast cancer. So when we're looking at epidemiological studies and trying to look at various lifestyle factors, nutritional factors, and correlation with disease, we now have to realize that you must look at the genetics of the populations because you may be led down the wrong pathway, because genetics has huge impact on susceptibility to environmental toxins. Okay, now, how to determine body load of metals? So basically all tissues have been used. Blood, urine, hair, nails, everything's been used. The big challenge is you have to differentiate between acute exposure and chronic exposure. And I'll show you some interesting cases this afternoon. Now, in general, blood levels and urine levels tend to reflect acute exposure pretty well. They're not perfect, but they're the best we have. And in general, most of the standards that are accepted by the federal government are using the blood levels, as I said before, 95% confidence limits. The problem is that current exposure does not tell you what the body load is. And so we have to become more sophisticated in how we assess body load. So there are several ways we can look at whether a person has toxic exposure. We can do a questionnaire. So here's a questionnaire that was put together by one of my graduates, Stephen, I'm sorry, that skipped over, go back. Stephen Neustadt, one of my graduates, and he put together a simple questionnaire for metal exposure. Now this is really simple. It's only going to get your major sources of metals, but you've got to start somewhere. I looked at mercury and did a blunt force approach. What I did is I looked at, I'm not exaggerating, I looked at 100 studies that gave the symptoms of people with mercury exposure. I then averaged them all up, and this is what I came up with. Look at this. Number one symptom is depression. What's one of the most common reasons why people go to see doctors today? Depression. Now, is depression due to a deficiency of, what's your favorite, pardon? Well, what's your favorite drug for depression in Australia? Say again? Dexapro? Lexapro, okay. So is depression due to deficiency in Lexapro? No. Is it due to a deficiency in vitamin D? Quite possibly. Is it due to mercury toxicity? Look at this. The most common symptom is depression in people with mercury toxicity. Okay. So my recommendation is if you want to look at the toxic load of metals in people is to do provocation testing. So with provocation testing, you put a test molecule into people and then determine how much metals come out. So here, let me show. Here's what we did in Canada. So we were looking at mercury levels. We want to know what the mercury levels were in the Canadian oil field workers, these 4,500 oil field workers. And first thing we measured was their red blood cell levels, because that was a standard that's most accepted. And we found some people with elevated mercury. We then found out a more sensitive measure would be whole blood. We've got a little better assessment, but then we did challenge testing. What we did here was we took a first morning urine, which shows us acute exposure. We then gave them 300 milligrams oral DMPS and collected the urine for 2 hours and looked at how much mercury was in their urine. Okay? And here's what you find. So here's our acute exposure, but now look at this differentiation. We're much better able to differentiate within the population the amount of mercury that were stored in people's bodies. So you look at deviations from the mean, 14% in just looking at RBC mercury, 29% just looking at whole blood mercury, and then 91% looking at the challenge urine. So clearly we're much better able to differentiate what was going on in the population. So then we decided to do a study ourselves looking at blood mercury, urine mercury, and then challenge mercury. So again, we looked at correlation between the amount of fillings in the person's mouth and these various measures of mercury. So that's important because now we know fillings in the mouth are correlated with the amount of mercury in the body. So our next question was, okay, now what measure do we have that best correlates with the amount of mercury in the mouth? So we'll look at first morning urine. We saw some 0.4 correlation with, which is some. Is this thing working? Okay. We then looked at whole blood correlation. It was okay. We looked at we looked at amalgams. So we'll look at amalgams pre-urine, 0.26, not very good. Amalgams of whole blood, 0.36, a little better, and the amalgams post-urine, a 0.44. So clearly, 0.44 is not great, but as you can see, it was better than blood, and it was better than urine. So my assessment at this point is that challenge testing is the best way to determine metals in the body. Okay, so here's an example, and now this is the protocol that I'm now using. I've used this in quite a number of people. The problem with only using oral DMPS is that DMPS only binds to mercury. It doesn't bind to other metals. So what I recommend now is you do a first morning urine. You then give them 300 milligrams of DMPS, which helps determine how much mercury is in the body, and then give them 500 milligrams of DMSA, which helps determine the amount of lead and cadmium in the body, and mercury to some degree as well. But the DMPS is better for mercury, and then collect your urine for 6 hours. And so with that, we get a very nice correlation with the measure of how much metals are in the person's body. So that's what I did with this 50-year-old Japanese man, very wealthy, one of the wealthiest men in Japan, smoked, ate a lot of sushi. He did not follow my advice because I said, here, you have all these levels of metals in your body. Got to get them out of your body. He didn't follow my advice. 2 years later, he had cancer. Now, I don't know if I could have prevented the cancer or not, but it sure looked to me like he was at high risk. Okay, POPs, persistent organic pollutants. Now, while you can directly measure the POPs, the problem is there aren't very many labs to do it. I'm not aware of any lab in Australia that does it. And also, you need to measure at least 75, preferably about 100 POPs. And the problem is even if you can measure it, it's very, very expensive. It typically costs $15 to $25 per POP you measure, so it's hard to get the number of POPs, to get the POPs measured. The good news is that we have indirect measures of total body load of POPs, and these measures actually turn out to be quite useful. The first one, and the one with the most research, is GGT, or GTTP. Now, as you know, GTTP is a standard liver enzyme that's measured to test people for hepatitis. And so when people have GTTs over 100, in the hundreds, you know they probably have hepatitis because their cells are now leaking enzymes from being damaged. It turns out that within the normal range, GGT goes up in proportion to chemical exposure. Now, why is GGT doing that? Well, GTTP recycles glutathione. So when people have increased toxic exposure, they need to produce more GGT in order to protect themselves from those chemical toxins. So it turns out that not only does GGT give us an indirect measure of total POP load, it correlates with disease. So we then start looking at people with a GGT, again, in the normal range, above 50, a 26-fold increased risk of diabetes. A GGT between 40 and 49, again, right in the middle of the normal range, has a 20-fold increased risk for diabetes. A GGT of 30 to 60 has an 8-fold increased risk of diabetes. So it turns out that these levels correlate with a wide range of diseases. Okay, now how about alcohol consumption? Now this I thought was kind of interesting. It turns out that we produce GGT in direct proportion to the amount of alcohol we're consuming. Now that when I say we, I say 90% of the population. About 10% of the population don't produce glutathione in response to chemical exposure, and they're probably the ones who are most damaged by these chemicals. But this is interesting, looking at alcohol consumption and GGT. So you know that people who consume modest amounts of alcohol have a decreased rate of death from all-cause mortality. So it turns out that that rate is right here. So what's hypothesized is what happens is with small amounts of alcohol consumption, we overproduce glutathione in response to toxic exposure, and extra glutathione now protects us from other things, which is why low amounts of alcohol are protective for our bodies. Now, of course, alcohol also increases HDL production, but turns out it looks like I got into an argument with my grandfather. My grandfather lived to be 95 years of age, so he probably knew something. And back when I was an early naturopath, I was teetotaler, I was totally pure. My grandfather said, you know, you're in a long-lived family, and we all drank 1 to 2 glasses of wine every night with dinner. You're not going to be healthy if you don't drink wine with dinner. Well, the old guy was right. Okay, So a little bit of alcohol is good for us. Okay, so GGT not only correlates with POP exposure, it also correlates with metal exposure. So this one's looking at urinary levels of cadmium, and as you can see, a very clear correlation, again, within the normal range between cadmium exposure and GGT. Okay. Then you start looking at GGT levels and correlation with risk of death, and people with the highest levels of GGT, again, in the normal range, have a 3 to 4-fold increased risk of death from all-cause mortality. So what we have here is an indirect measure of body load of toxins, and it's clearly correlating with increased damage to the body, increased rate of death. Okay, so GGT from our Canadian oilfield workers. So look at these numbers. Okay, so a big portion of them had a lot of elevated GGT, I mean, really high. And remember, if we go back to 30, whoops, come back. You know, if we go over 30, where there's an 8-fold increased risk, about 6% of them had over 30 as their level of GGT. So you're all back there sitting smugly in your chairs thinking, well, oil field workers, right? Exposed to oils in the chemical fields, right? You're all thinking that, right? No? How many are not thinking that? Raise your hands, please. Okay. Okay. So what this means for these oil field workers is they get in the trucks in the morning, they drive out to an oil pump somewhere in the prairie, check and make sure it's working properly, and drive on to the next one. No chemical exposure in the oil fields. So how come they have these really high levels of GTT? Okay, much higher than you see in the general population. Pardon? Oh, drinking alcohol? Yeah, they drink alcohol, but so does everybody else. They're hobby farmers. Most of them are working in the oil fields to support the family farm, which is no longer quite viable because of agri-farming. And what are they doing on their family farms? Spraying chemicals, and who's eating the foods that they're spraying the chemicals on? Us, okay? So all this chemical exposure, so they are basically the ones getting the most chemical exposure because they're spraying the stuff on, and that's why these people have high chemical exposure, okay? So again, real data, real people, real health effects on these people. Okay, turns out there's other measures. Uric acid, turns out uric acid goes up in proportion to fluorinated hydrocarbon exposure. ALT, another standard liver enzyme, again, early research, but looks like ALT also goes up in direct proportion to chemical exposure. And a study just came out a week before this lecture was due, and it looked at bilirubin, and looked at fluorinated hydrocarbons, and looked at uric acid, AST, ALT, GGT, and bilirubin, and found that actually bilirubin was the best of all the measures for detecting chemical exposure. Now, a big factor to be aware of with these measures is that they all don't react to all chemicals. Some react to one form of chemicals, some react to another form of chemicals. Sometimes you look at a whole list of there's like over 100 PCBs. Some react to like 5 of the PCBs, some don't react to other ones. So I'm now becoming very, very interested in using all of these standard blood tests as indirect measures of total body load, again, within the normal range. Now look at this one. This slide is not in your handout. I hate it when lecturers give these great slides and half the slides aren't in their handout. So I don't do that, with this one exception, because I just found this study. This study is really interesting because it's a predictive study. So what it did is it said, okay, we know that POPs cause an increase in LDL cholesterol. There's a correlation between POP level and LDL cholesterol. So does increased POPs cause LDL cholesterol to rise? So they looked at a group of people, took a bunch of people who are 70 years old, they measured 23 different POPs, they then followed them for 5 years to see if the correlation between POP level and increases in their LDL cholesterol, and look up what they found. So looking at just one POP, they got a 10% increase in LDL cholesterol based on just one POP. Okay, so pretty interesting. So to summarize then, how do you determine total body load? First, I want to look at GGT. I don't know what the cutoff is. For sure, it's at least 30. It may be as low as 25. It may be as low as 20. I don't know. Personally, my GGT is 23, and I'm pretty careful of how I live my life. Uric acid above about 5 milligrams per deciliter probably is indicative of chemical load. At this point, we think it's primarily the fluorinated chemicals, like your Teflon pans. If you use your Gore-Tex, if you spray chemicals on your outdoor gear to keep off the water and let perspiration go through, all those are these fluorinated hydrocarbons. ALT, perhaps above 30 units per liter, and bilirubin above about 0.8 milligrams per deciliter, all appear to be indicative of toxic load. So I would say look at those things. I'll show you a case history in a moment. Look at those things. Now I would say probably LDL cholesterol is also predictive, although I don't have good enough data other than that last slide that I showed you. Metal load, I think this is pretty straightforward. It's not generally accepted, but I think it's pretty straightforward. And that is first more in urine for current exposure, then for total body load of cadmium, mercury, and lead. Oral DMPS 300 milligrams, 500 milligrams of DMSA, collect urine for 6 hours. At this point, probably the best measure of arsenic is nails or hair. Okay. Again, I'm not as clear on that data as I am on the other ones. Okay. So, did I hit the timing right? Okay. So, can I start my interventions lecture? So, person in the back, could you start my interventions lecture? Okay. Anybody want to ask any questions while we're waiting for the intervention lecture to start? Now, do we have a microphone?
Do you want to do the questions now and then run the lecture at the end, or questions after the lecture?
Let's do some questions now about damage and assessment, and then I would like to start on my intervention because I have so much to cover. Yes.
Can I just say, as a farmer's daughter, that one of the major exposures of cadmium in Australia is that the superphosphate that we got for years from Nauru, it was full of cadmium, and so all our...
So what was it, had the cadmium in it?
The superphosphate
from
Nauru,
right,
which is where it all came from. And so now our paddocks are absolutely full of cadmium.
Yes, very good observation. So remember I mentioned that cigarette smoking is the source of about half the cadmium in people's bodies. It's not because tobacco is so bad, it's because tobacco is grown with synthetic fertilizers that have high levels of cadmium in it, the cadmium that gets into tobacco leaf, and when we inhale it, it goes through our bodies very, very efficiently. Thank you, that's exactly the problem.
How long is the intervention?
Well, that's by the afternoon lecture, but I want to get started on it.
You want to get started, so how much now? 15 minutes or?
How about 10 minutes to get started?
10 minutes, okay. So can we get a couple more just questions right now? I'm positive there are some. I'm going to just make one note. You've explained something for me. My toxic patients, they lose their alcohol tolerance, but they keep their high GGT. And every doctor thinks they're secretly just taking the alcohol, and so when doctors see GGT, they think secret alcoholic. They don't raise the question, but these are teetotalers with raised GGT. And you're saying that will be a measure that you could look at for successful detoxification.
Yes.
A good outcome would be a dropping GGT?
Exactly. So that's exactly right on. So as it turns out, I don't know if you do this in Australia, but in the US, one of the ways that the law enforcement determines whether people stop smoking, stop drinking or not, is they measure GTTs.
Uh-huh.
And you're right, so GTT will go down when we stop drinking alcohol, but if you have high chemical exposure, it'll stay up.
You're in trouble.
And not only that, but if you, do any of you know Alan Goldhammer, the chiropractor who does all the fasting in Northern California? Anyway, so he's an expert in fasting, and so I gave him a call a year ago and said, hey, Alan, have you measured GTTs on your patients? Because if you're detoxifying them, I would think your GTT would go down. He said, I'm way ahead of you. I've been measuring GTT, and after a 1 week water fast, all the GTTs go down by 20%. Okay, so clearly detoxification does drop GTT.
Now we have somebody, where's the person with the microphone?
So the technology people, were you able to load my next lecture?
I think it's ready. I'll go and check that.
Let's ask questions until that happens.
I was just going to ask, I'm a GP as well, and we get, like you, we get lots of people who have unexplained GGTs. And
a little louder?
We get lots of people who've got unexplained raised GGTs and unexplained raised uric acid levels, and you think, well, they've got nothing wrong with them, their kidneys are fine, their liver's actually fine. So all of those people, again, like Mark said, we should be really looking at their toxic load.
Yes, they've got toxic load. That's what the research is showing very clearly.
And other things we get taught that raised bilirubin in unexplained situations is Gilbert's disease. So should we be thinking, well, maybe they've not just got that and we've got to...
That's a very good question, and that is, we do know they get unexplained elevation in bilirubin in Gilbert's disease. Okay, that's true. So if all you're getting is bilirubin elevation and there's no toxic load, then you should consider Gilbert's disease, but there's also tests you can do to see if it actually is or not.
And my final question is, you said 10% of people don't raise their GGT in response to alcohol. How do we know who those people are?
Yes, so I'm right now working on my lecture on genomics and glutathione, because I think that's important for that 10% of the population. And I don't understand it well enough yet to give you an answer, okay? But I'll get there.
Just one note on Gilbert's syndrome or Gilbert's disease. There are really two distinct types. There's the ones that bilirubin is, say, 27, 27, 26, 25, no matter what, it's stable. And there's a genetic component to that. There's another term, Gilbert's disease, where they're 15s, 12s, 2s, up to 27, and we forget that bilirubin is in fact an antioxidant protective molecule produced by the liver for self-protection. So often what's called Gilbert's is not in fact Gilbert's, it's a normal person producing bilirubin sufficiently to protect, and it's a liver self-protection, and when they get well, their bilirubin drops down and stays down in the normal range.
Interesting.
Was one over here?
Yeah, I was just wondering about copper and whether you were testing free copper and then whether there was any association with persistent organic pollutants, given that copper comes up in response to estrogen and estrogen-like compound exposure.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I have not looked at the copper question, so I don't have an answer for you there.
Other questions? Where is the microphone? Down there? I'm
Did
following the microphone. There's one up the front here soon.
Did I hear correctly that you don't recommend people take DIM and I3C?
No.
Is that right?
No, I did not say that at all. So one of the curiosities, I think the body has remarkable wisdom, and I sometimes wonder, now, why did the body decide to do that? So why do we have all these liver detoxification enzymes? And then I started looking at, well, when you eat cabbage, you upregulate a bunch of your liver enzymes, detoxification enzymes. Now, is that because cabbage is particularly good for us, or is it because cabbage has things in it that over time we evolved and we realized we had to protect ourselves from? And so that's why we have that enzyme there. So by upregulating that enzyme, we're not protecting ourselves from the chemicals in cabbage, but then all the other toxins that get detoxified by the same pathway, we now get rid of more efficiently. So that's why women have an inverse correlation between cabbage consumption and breast cancer, is because cabbage helps upregulate the enzymes that detoxify the chemicals in the environment that are particularly damaging to the breast. So,
Joe, you've mentioned that hair tissue analysis is a good way of testing arsenic levels in the body. What are your thoughts of hair tissue analysis for other heavy metals?
it's a bit challenging. And I used to believe that the hair was a great way for testing heavy metals. I still think it's useful depending upon the individual. What the research is now showing is some people have trouble getting rid of metals through the hair. So if you have a patient with high levels of mercury or metals in the hair and you treat them and the hair levels go down, you're on the right track. But if you have a person who you think has high levels of metals and you do the hair analysis and they're not elevated, I wouldn't trust it. Because again, and this looks like autistic kids in particular have a lot of trouble getting rid of mercury, and it does not go out in the hair.
Joe, humans have 1,000-fold variability in detoxification. Like, what is it like? Is it 1,000? But like, is it 0.1% has 1,000? Like, what is it? Most of it? You know, what I'm trying to say.
Oh, wait, if you saw that slide I showed you, it was a substantial portion. So the Caucasians, for example, 7% CD2, CYP2D6 basically just doesn't work, whereas 30% of blacks is overactive. We're not talking about 1 out of 1,000 people. We're talking about 7 out of 100, just that one enzyme. So that's true of all of those cyclone P450s, and it's true of all the CYP, of the phase 2 as well. Yeah, so these are real correlations. And by the way, I'm working now on a lecture on detoxification and cancer, and I'm finding some very, very strong disease correlation, cancer risk correlation with genomics. So, and it's all in the phase 1 and phase 2. And what you find is people with an overactive phase 1 and an underactive phase 2 based on genetics have substantially increased risk of cancer. And I will probably be about a year before I give that lecture, but I'm working on it right now.
Go down here first, and there's some over here, back and the side there. Okay, next.
Could you speculate a bit about the best way to remove mercury or cadmium from kidney, brains, bone?
Yes, please attend the afternoon lecture. I have not a great data, but I've got great case histories.
Over
Yes.
here.
Joe, one of my clients, a really interesting case, she had a hair mineral analysis done. She was very acutely disturbed, ended up in a psychiatric unit. Her copper and mercury were off the graph with the hair mineral analysis. Her serum blood testing was normal. And then I treated her, it came down with the hair, yet the serum still stayed the same, and the doctors wouldn't believe that she was toxic.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's the problem with the serum, is that it's giving acute exposure, but they've got a body load in the tissues that are causing damage.
Yeah, so it's come down by half, but the arsenic's gone up in the hair, so which is strange.
So our bodies have a limited ability to get rid of these toxins, and sometimes once you get rid of one metal, you've now left the excretion route available for other metals.
But-
reminds me of a, sorry, finish.
Yes, one of the things you said that I think it was acute cases, the blood would show the heavy metals, yet in her case it was just the hair, and she was very acute. She was extremely disturbed.
Right.
But she couldn't even stay alone. They had to admit her to a psychiatric unit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Acute though, is it in acute exposure or acute
Acute
medical presentation?
Presentation.
Yeah, so the exposure could have been
Extremely.
chronic.
Yeah, you can have very high levels of these things in the brain, and the blood and urine look fine because it's past exposure. And once it gets in the brain, it's really hard to get out, but we can do it.
Yeah. So because the Medico is just totally,
So actually, it reminds me of a patient which also relates to this question over here. I had a woman come to see me who was having health problems, and nobody gets offended by this. She was the local spiritual leader. And this woman would have spiritual visions that were very insightful, and she had quite a congregation. She came to see me. She was having health problems. I found she had very high copper levels. I put her on a healthier diet, got the copper out. She got healthier and stopped having her visions. Stopped having her visions. So she was really mad at me. So, I mean, perhaps you need more copper in your brain to be sensitive to the universe. I don't know, but that was an unfortunate result.
I think the visionaries at Delphi were on top of a little vent of hydrogen sulfide, and when they took them away, no visions occurred. There was no predictions, and wars were lost when the visions stopped.
Wow, really?
So
Oh,
yes, you've got to be
interesting.
careful removing visions from people.
Right.
Is there one more down here?
Yes, as a naturopath, we don't have access to using things like the oral DMPS and DMSA. And as I understand it, the TGA is changing the rules on oral ingestive testing anyway. So if we can't use that, what do you think is the next best thing?
I've had that question before, and I guess I'm going to be very blunt. Develop a collaboration with a medical doctor who can do it and get the test done properly. Because you'll hear me say that a bit this afternoon about interventions as well. We have a lot of good natural interventions, but there's also some drug interventions that if people are high enough, they need to have them. And so that's an area where I'm a great believer in integrative collaborative care. And at this point, this challenge testing is the best that I know of for determining body load of metals. That's all there is to it.
I think we have one over here. Is it? Oh, I thought there was hands up. No more questions?
Right on time.
Shall we proceed on to your video?
So I thought it was supposed to be done at 9:20. Am I wrong?
No, 9:40. You've got another.
Oh,
15
great.
minutes.
Okay. So were you able to load my second lecture? Great. Okay. Thank you.
You can start that now.
Onward. Okay. So we now talked about the toxins we're exposed to, how they damage the body, how you assess it. Now we want to talk about what to do about it, and then case history. So I'm going to start talking about what to do about the toxic load, and then we'll finish it this afternoon and do with the case histories. Okay. So number one is decreased exposure. That might sound trite, But what good does it do to get the stuff out of people's bodies if you don't stop the exposure? And I'll give you an interesting observation about that. So, as you may know, the American Dental Association has totally poo-pooed the idea about mercury from fillings being a problem for people. So they did a study where they took people who had an average of 20 fillings. They then gave them IV chelation therapy with DMPS. We'll talk about that later on. And they found that their blood levels of mercury did indeed go down, but within 24 hours, they were back to what they were before the DMPS IV chelation therapy. So they said, see, isn't this stupid, the idea that IV chelation therapy helps people with mercury problems? Because the mercury just fills right back up again. Doesn't that tell you that if you don't take the fillings out, I don't care how much chelation you do, the mercury just comes back in again? I mean, I don't understand why they publish things like that. Okay, so decrease exposure, always deal with the cause, okay? We can have all wonderful natural medicine interventions, but if you don't deal with the cause, limit to what you can accomplish. So decrease exposure. That means basically an organic, mostly plant-based diet. It means choosing low mercury fish. It means using low POP health and beauty aids. So, you know those lotions and potions we lather on ourselves to make us look and smell pretty and handsome, etc.? Well, those things have what are called fragrances. And those fragrances basically have high levels of phthalates. So what happens is the fragrance has to be solubilized and stabilized. It's solubilized, stabilized with fragrances. And those fragrances then smell nice, but we then get the phthalates in our bodies, and the phthalates disrupt our biochemistry. Okay? And I'll show you some real hard data on what it looks like a person using low levels of health and beauty aids versus one using all levels of health and beauty aids, 400 times as much phthalates in the body. We'll show you that in a moment. If a person has amalgams, you've got to remove the amalgams. Now, the amalgams have to be removed by an ecological dentist. If all you do is go in and drill out the amalgams, so dentists will say to you, well, if I take out your amalgams, I'll just increase your mercury levels, and the answer is true. If you drill out a person's mercury fillings, you increase the amount of mercury in the blood by 50 to 100%, and it doesn't go back to what it was beforehand. I'm not saying normal. It doesn't go back to what it was beforehand for 2 years. That gives you an idea of how bad it is to drill out mercury fillings. So you have to chip them out, not drill them out. Make sure you have a lot of air filtration, and also many ecological dentists will actually give people chelating agents while they're doing the mercury removal, so that any mercury that does get into the body gets removed as quickly as possible. If a person has heavy metals, you want to chelate them out. And I'll tell you about a relatively safe way I've developed for doing this, where I have good data showing that it does work. Glutathione. It's hard to overstate the importance of glutathione. I'm going to spend a fair amount of time this afternoon to talk about glutathione. Glutathione is wonderful. Glutathione acts as an intracellular and intramitochondrial antioxidant, protects us from chemical and metal toxins. Glutathione binds to mercury in the brain and actively transports it across the blood-brain barrier into the blood. And glutathione helps then get the POPs out of the body and into the gut. So glutathione is incredibly important. If you look at species longevity, those species that are most able to produce glutathione are the ones that live the longest. There are a bunch of supportive therapies we can use. Antioxidant support, detoxification support, we'll talk about that. And finally, systemic detoxification. These age-old natural medicine interventions like saunas and fasting and hydrotherapy, turns out there's hard data showing that these things get toxins out of the body more quickly. So before I go any further, I'd like to quote a dear friend of mine, Dr. Sid Baker, MD. How many of you have heard Sid Baker lecture? If you get the opportunity, please do so. Sid is a wonderful lecturer, and why he's wonderful is because of his remarkable ability to synthesize complex information and come up with very simple, clear guidelines that have huge insight. So, for example, a quote from Dr. Sid. He said, all of medicine is really quite simple. Get into the person get into each person what they uniquely need, and get out of each person what they uniquely do not need. So nutrition and detoxification. So all this lecture is about is recognizing the uniqueness of our patients for having to get toxins out of the bodies and then how to do that. So If you get nutrition to your patients and get toxins out, that takes care of most of medicine. Okay, so let's look at this some more detail. So when we tell a person you need to eat organically grown foods, the first thing they're going to say is it's too expensive. It is true, organically grown foods are more expensive. So then you can say, okay, some foods are particularly high in pesticides, and some foods are relatively low in pesticides. So the foods that are low in pesticides, eat conventionally grown. If they're high in pesticides, only eat them if they're organically grown. Now, when I say only, okay, occasionally eating conventionally grown foods is not going to kill you. It'll increase your risk for disease, but it's not going to kill you. Okay, so eat some. So as you can see here, here's the list, and they call it the dirty dozen. Well, they now call it the dirty dozen plus 2 because the organophosphate pesticides on the kale. I don't know what's on hot peppers, but it's on the kale. Now, in terms of the Clean 15, as you can see this list here, you can see here is cabbage. So the cabbage family of foods have all these natural antimicrobial or anti-insect compounds that they secrete. And so you see cauliflower and cabbage are on that list. So those foods look like they're pretty good for consumption. Okay. Now, mercury in fish, there's basically a 10-fold variation between the concentration of mercury in the fish with the lowest amount of mercury, which are the small fish, versus those with the highest amount of mercury. So obviously the fish you want to eat are those which have the highest amount of omega-3 fatty acids and the lowest amount of mercury. And Stephen, raise your hand. Stephen has some business cards on them, and these business cards I carry in my wallet, Stephen. And on those business cards, it has a list of the foods which are the least toxic and most toxic. It also has a list of the fish which have the lowest mercury and the highest omega-3 fatty acids. So when you're traveling, you can just easily figure out what to eat. So that's very, very useful. So in general, I recommend to people, I think fish are a very important food to eat. Omega-3 fatty acids, 17% of a child's IQ is determined by the omega-3 fatty acid content of his or her mother's diet while she's pregnant. So omega-3 fatty acids are incredibly important. Sardines, anchovies, and small salmon are the most practical of all these in terms of reasonable taste and also high levels of omega-3s and low levels of mercury. Okay. Decreased exposure, health and beauty aids. Okay, health and beauty aids. Here's looking at a guy like me who's not using any of these health and beauty aids. And this is what happens when we add cologne, and then aftershave, and then hair gel, and then deodorant, and then lotion. 400 times the level of phthalates in the body compared to somebody who's not using all these things. Now, why let's say this is actually done in men. So why are these young men using all these lotions and potions? Because they want to be more attractive to the members of the fairer sex, right? Well, some days, okay, same sex too, okay, fine. Anyway, same problem. They poison testosterone receptor sites. So as he's making himself smell nicer, he's actually less male. Okay. That's, of course, if you define being male as your level of testosterone. Anyway, moving on. Eating organically grown foods versus conventionally grown foods. This study was done in Seattle, and what the researchers did here, the public health researchers, they stood in front of the health food store, and when women coming out with their children asked, do your children eat at least 75% of the foods organically grown? They said yes to put them in the study. They stood in front of the conventional grocery store and asked, do your children eat at least 75% of their foods conventionally grown? They said yes, put them in the study. They then looked at the level of organophosphate pesticides in the blood and urine of kids eating the organically grown foods versus conventionally grown foods. And here are the poor kids eating the organic, conventionally grown foods, 9 times the level of organophosphate pesticides in their blood and urine. A level well known to decrease IQ and double the incidence of ADHD, okay, just from chemical exposure. Okay, for eliminating POPs. So to eliminate POPs, there's limited research on how to do this, but what's there is actually promising. One is, if you want to look at potentially a drug approach, particularly people with high levels of POPs, it turns out the biosequestrants are very good. So biosequestrants like cholestyramine and cholestyramide were used to help get rid of cholesterol. Now the problem is, of course, while they're decreasing cholesterol, they cause all kinds of other problems. Turns out these things are also, not only do they get rid of cholesterol, they also get rid of the POPs. Now here's a key important factor in terms of how the body gets rid of these chemical toxins. So the body goes through a lot of metabolic energy in the liver with both phase 1 and phase 2 to get the pops into the gut and dump it into get the pops into the bile and dump them into the gut. Now, once they get into the gut, the body is expected there to be fiber in the gut to then bind to the chemicals and get them out through the stools. Now, as we evolved as a species, we had 100 to 150 grams of fiber per day in our diet. How much fiber do we consume now? So you Australians consume about 15 to 20 grams a day. So what happens is there's not enough fiber in the gut to absorb the toxins that are being excreted, and so you get intrahepatic recirculation. So a lot of these chemicals we went through all this trouble to get rid of now get recirculated back into the body. So it turns out that if you use things that are binding, are biosequestrants or fiber in the gut, you actually increase the way in which we get rid of chemical toxins. So the good news is that by increasing people's fiber in their diet, if you do nothing but increase fiber in the diet, you will help get rid of toxic load. So if you decrease exposure and increase fiber, that itself is an effective strategy. But there's a lot more we can do. Next thing that's really important for the not just chemicals but metals as well is the glutathione. We'll talk a lot about that. Antioxidant support and sweating, increased excretion of heavy metals, and also chemicals in the sweat. We'll talk about that in a moment. Cruciferous vegetables, of course, and again, saunas, fasting, and hydrotherapy, all are effective measures getting rid of chemicals and getting rid of metals. Okay. So I think that's probably the place to stop right here. And so in our workshops this afternoon, we're going to start with this slide. And we're now getting deeply into how to get mercury out of the body and what my experience has been doing this with real people.
Before you leave, we still have 5 minutes.
Okay.
I'm sure that some questions, like an hour of questions, has arisen from 4 slides there. So could I get the microphones again, just for the last few minutes? There's one over here. I have a comment that I see chemically sensitive and chemically injured patients. That's the kind of core of my practice. The one thing they all do is they maintain their organic diet. Against all odds, they'll forego anything because every time they come off that diet, they sicken. And so the cost of that food is excessive. There's no upside beyond the fact that that's the only way that they can stay well. So I assume they're right on the edge, and any extra load at that point is just the thing that pushes them over.
Yes.
It's a remarkable constant amongst my patients that if they choose one thing, they choose an organic diet. We have someone down here.
Yes, I'd just like to know what your thoughts are about the selenium content of fish relative to their mercury levels, and whether the selenium is actually protective and binds with the mercury.
Actually, yes, that's an extremely good question. So in fish, you have not only omega-3 fatty acids, you also have selenium that has that counteractive effect of mercury. So one of the fun things in my life is I'm the editor-in-chief of a journal called Integrative Medicine, a clinician's journal, or IMCJ for short. So I actually had a great submission about 2 years ago. I don't know if I put that in these slides or not. This was from a group that was doing corporate executive wellness programs. And so one of the things they were doing was they were measuring omega-3 fatty acid levels, measuring mercury levels, and looking at fish consumption. And they're doing psychomotor testing on these people as well. And they were curious, and that to answer exactly the same question was that, are there beneficial effects from eating these fish which have mercury in them? Do the omega-3 fatty acids and selenium overwhelm the mercury? And what they found was no. What they found is that the more big fish they ate, and as the mercury levels went up, it didn't matter how much omega-3 fatty acids they had, how much selenium they had, it did not prevent psychomotor dysfunction. Now, of course, they had less psychomotor dysfunction because of the selenium and omega-3 fatty acids, but the bottom line was it wasn't enough to counteract the mercury. But it's an extremely good question. I had exactly the same question. Yes?
2 questions. Just in terms of doing the testing for heavy metals, either doing just a straight urine or blood or a provocative test, how many days before that do you get them to eliminate, not have any sort of fish in their diet?
Right. So does anybody know how long mercury from fish lasts in your body? To do what the half-life is? Anybody know the half-life?
A couple of weeks.
Yeah, very close, about 30 days. Half-life's about 30 days. So the reality is that if people are eating fish, it will have an impact. So that's why I like doing the acute first morning urine and then the total body load, because that way you can help differentiate between what they're currently getting and what's built up in their body. So yes, don't eat any fish for a few days beforehand, but the reality is that the half-life is so long, think it makes that big a difference.
The 5+2 diet is becoming very popular here. I don't know how it is over in the States, with 2 non-consecutive fasting days a week, and I mean there is no shortage of other fasting regimes. To the extent that when you fast you are going to be liberating fat-soluble toxins from your fat stores, what's your view about fasting and what you need to do when you're fasting, especially in that 5+2 context, to protect yourself?
Extremely good question. So, question, how many of you have supervised water fasts in your patients? How many have supervised at least a 4-day water fast?
Yeah.
How many have supervised at least a 1-week water fast? How many have supervised at least a 1-month water fast? Okay, so I have supervised hundreds of fasts. Okay, no question, when people are fasting, they increase the release of toxins in the body. If a person is highly toxic with lots of toxins in their fat, I believe water fasting is probably not a good idea. Okay, so those people I would use the protein-sparing modified food fasts. We have a lot of fiber and you're not losing weight too fast. But unless if their toxic load is not excessive, it turns out our bodies are really good at getting rid of those toxins, and so I've done a lot of water fasting with success in patients. Now I got into an argument with Jeff Bland. He said don't do water fasting because it depletes glutathione. I actually have a study showing that water fasting does not deplete glutathione because our wonderful bodies upregulate production of glutathione when you're fasting as a response to the increased toxic load. Very interesting.
I do have one data point for that. And in our clinic, we had one of Bill Ray's environmental clinics for a while. By sheer chance, people came in, they were fasting for allergy or for challenge testing.
Yes.
And we took the blood at 48 hours. Now, all of them had been told by a naturopath, you have liver stress. They had normal transaminases. 48 hours in, half of them had abnormal transaminases with just that kind of a break. And that shouldn't have been for nearly 2 weeks at the very earliest. So I have the suspicion that the people most susceptible are the people intoxicated the most, and they've got least reserves. At some point, they're the people to worry about if you do a water fast, that they may just lose that kind of sulfation pathway or the glutathionation, and unprotected, they become overtly medically unwell in a very short period of time.
It may. I won't argue with that. I think you have to be. I think it's harder now than it was 50 years ago to fast people because there's just so much more toxicity. And I think some of the upregulation enzymes you're seeing are the body's attempts to help get rid of those excess toxins that are being released.
Yeah, we read it as liver damage, but they are enzymes to do a job. And so you're inducing something for that.
Yes.
And one over here, and then we'll move on.
Hello. I wanted to ask about women with a history of cholestasis in pregnancy and elevated bilirubin and uric acid. Do you believe this has something to do with POPs? And what would you do in that situation?
I couldn't quite hear.
Cholestasis in pregnancy, raised uric acid, raised bilirubin in pregnancy, has it got anything to do with POPs?
Actually, that's a very good question. I would say yes. We do know that pregnancy substantially increases toxic load on women, and also if they're not consuming enough calories and are starting to use some of their fat stores, they'll release more chemical toxins as well. And most likely the elevation of liver enzymes that you're seeing is indeed indicative of toxic load. So that's the kind of situation where I would be especially careful about using things like fiber with lots and lots of fluids to help get rid of that bile, that wherever bile is being excreted as much as possible to try to keep that flow going out of the liver.
Okay, we're going to move on now. Thank you very, very much.